Said I wasn't going to spill coffee on the floor. I didn't say anything about me. There we go. The Godfather. Thank you. I didn't even ask him to do that, but that was pretty appropriate. Thank you. Okay. I never saw this movie until I was about 30. This was a movie I never saw. And to say I'm a little bit passionate about the movie now and its movie making, Godfather 1 and 2, Godfather 3 does not exist. Not a movie that matters. Forget about that one. Okay. I mentioned the Black Stallion. So that was the Black Stallion. That's him on the beach after the shipwreck and him kind of befriending the stallion. That's a laser disc or a video disc. That's what it looked like, and you put it in a big player. About 6 years ago, the Black Stallion was on some movie channel, something that happened. And it was the end, and I was watching the scene, and it was going back to the scene with him on the beach running around. And it goes to the credits. And the very first thing I see, directed by Francis Ford Coppola. And it triggered with me. That's why I really enjoyed The Godfather. I loved The Black Stallion. The way it was shot, the way the movie worked, the way everything kind of put together. And so when I saw Godfather some 20 years later, something about the way The Godfather was just kind of stuck with me, resonated with me, and it was because Francis Ford Coppola did both of them, right? There's something about that story there that kind of stuck with me. Well, why did I bring it up now? Because we're getting into the time now where Jesus just got arrested after last week, okay? And we're going to read through the passage, but he's going to go, according to John, before a man named Annas. Annas was the boss of bosses. Annas was the Godfather. In the terms of the youth, he was the OG. You guys, nobody, never mind. Okay. Huh? Wrong youth. If you grew up in the 90s, you'd get that reference, but that's okay. Yeah, I'm going to make an argument that who the Sadducees particularly the Sadducees, the chief priests, the people who run the temple, were far worse than anything that we see out of a movie called The Godfather. And we'll talk about that in a little bit. Let's get to the passage. So I want to read the passage real quick, and then this is a quick hitting passage. It's the narrative of what happened, and John does it very interesting. He'll bring up something with Jesus, then he brings up something with Peter, because this is also John's telling of Peter's denial. And then he goes back to the trial before Annas, then he goes back to Peter here. So he's kind of got this almost movie quality way in which he's putting it, which actually falls near and dear to my heart because movie. Anyway, so we're going to read the passage real quick, and then we'll kind of get through the passage and see some things that I never saw. Things that because I had to put something together on this that stuck with me, that went, wow. Basically, we make assumptions all our lives. Okay? And particularly, if you've been a believer a long time, you make some assumptions with Scripture that you believe are absolutely true because you've been doing it for 35 years of your life or 40 years of your life. I'm not going to go any higher than that. Okay? And then sometimes something just hits you and you go, my assumptions for the last 35 years are wrong. And we'll get there. So the soldiers, their commanding officer, and the temple guards arrested Jesus and tied him up. First, they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. Caiaphas was the one who had told the other Jewish leaders, it's better that one man should die for the people. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so that he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate when the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching the gate, and she let Peter in. The woman asked Peter, you're not one of the man's disciples, are you? No, he said, I am not. Because it was cold, the house servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it, warming themselves, and Peter stood with them, warming himself. Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he had been teaching them. Jesus replied, "Everyone knows what I teach. I have preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple where the people gather. I have not spoken in secret. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said." Then one of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. "Is that the way to answer the high priest?" he demanded. Jesus replied, "If I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I am speaking the truth, why are you beating me?" Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, "You're not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I am not." But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" Again, Peter denied it, and immediately a rooster crowed. Okay? The story, the narrative in which we get. And interestingly enough, each of the gospel writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and now John, tell this story with different angles, different places, different things they emphasize. And I just kind of combine them into this list of what went on. Number one, 6 different trials took place for Jesus. There was one before Annas. This happened at 2 a.m, by the way. It wasn't even the break of dawn. It was after midnight. They arrest Jesus. They walk, as long as it took them to get from the Mount of Olives into Jerusalem, into the area that the high priests kind of had as their headquarters. They took him into the place that Annas owned and had a trial with Annas. Then Annas sends him to Caiaphas, the current high priest. Then after Caiaphas, at the break of dawn, they end up with the entire Sanhedrin, with a trial before the Sanhedrin. Then they end up with Pilate. Pilate sends them to Herod because Herod happens to be in Jerusalem. Herod was the ruler of where? Where did Herod rule? Herod yeah. Where? No, north. This was not Herod the Great. His son, it was Herod Antipas. Yeah, there you go. He was the ruler of Galilee, so he should have been in Galilee, but he happened to be in Jerusalem at the time. Happened to be. So he sent him to Herod. Herod sent him back to Pilate, and it was after this last thing with Pilate in which finally it was, "I wash my hands of it, you can crucify him." Okay? 6 different trials took place from about 2 a.m. to about noon of that day. Okay? So what's that, 10 hours-ish? Maybe 11 hours in which all of this took place. Each gospel details Peter's denials. They all like to talk about Peter. Oh, for your deeds to go down for all of history to see. Peter, right? Here he is. Many testified falsely against him. They came in and said all kinds of crazy things. And actually in the other gospels, they actually record the craziest of things was he said he's going to tear down the temple. Okay? And I would make fun of that, except that I kind of said the same thing in a class back when I was in college and meant it. So I didn't even know. So I can't really say much against that one because I actually was stupid enough to actually kind of say that. So there's that. Jesus uses I am statement again, that I am. Remember, I am the bread of life. I am the way, the truth, and the life. I am the vine. That goes all the way back to where? Moses, right? The burning bush. Tell him I am who sees. So this phrase goes all the way back to Moses. It's kind of the name of God, so to speak, in terms of the phrase that is I am. It's used against him in this level. This is what they end up using against him in the trials, so to speak. John adds this interesting tidbit of this trial with Annas. The other gospel writers don't talk about Annas. They talk about him before Caiaphas. They talk about him before the Sanhedrin, but they don't talk about him with Annas. John's the only one that does this. And John also adds that and we assume it was him that had access to get into this area, that he knew somebody in there so that he could go in and then he let Peter in. Okay? This is the stories that as we've known them. John, again, unique. He's got this wild view because he actually has experience that the original gospel writers didn't have. He's got 40 years of experience now. He's seen all the things that have gone on since Jesus, since Nero killed all the Christians in around 60 AD, since the temple was destroyed in 70 AD. There's a lot that John knows by the time he's writing his gospel. The synoptics, he knew what they had written already. He knew what heresies had come across. And now most of the main characters were now gone and dead other than him. He could write anything he wanted to about them and nobody was going to get upset. Okay? So, we get to, they arrested Jesus. First, they took him to Annas. Who was Annas? All right. I call him the boss of bosses. This is the Don. He's the one. He has control over everything temple-related, religious-related that's going on in Jerusalem. He's the guy. Why is he the guy? Well, the trial before, he was appointed high priest in AD 6, okay? AD 6, Annas was given high priest duties. And if you look at the second sentence, under Jewish law, the high priest was appointed for life. So Jews said, this guy's for life. Once you're the high priest, you're the high priest. But he was deposed by the governor Valerius Gratus in AD 15 of Rome. So Rome got a sense of who these people that were running this religious system was around them. And they didn't like the kind of power, influence, wealth, prestige that particular person wielded as the high priest. So they said, no more you, we need other people to be high priest. Well, he's the Don. What does the Don do? Who's next in line? The Don's son. It's Michael. It's Sonny. But he had 5 of them. And each of them, as Rome said, I need a new one, it just became a new son. By the time we get to Jesus' time, he's run out of sons. And so he also had a daughter who married a dude, and that dude became the dude. Someone got that one. Anyway. To put it lightly, Annas' family was powerful, rich, and corrupt. To put it very mildly. This is where I'm going to say, and we're going to go through some of these things. Anything you see from The Godfather, from the Mafia, from the documentaries on organized crime, to the South American drug lords, bad dudes. I present to you, these guys were worse. That's temple. That's kind of a rendition of Herod's temple. Of up here, in here would be the Holy of Holies. They'd be making the sacrifices out here. The courtyards around, things. This is where, this was the center of what had become religious life for the Jews. What went on at the temple? What was the main purpose of the temple for the people? Sacrifices. They're there to make sacrifices. Now, was it just during certain times, or did they make sacrifices all the time? They made sacrifices all the time. It just got heightened around the time of Passover, right? This is now becomes this. And last week I even said that the peak of its existence, what do they say? How many different lambs were slain during Passover at one point? What did you say? 250,000 is one of the records. Imagine in a 1-week stretch, 250,000 animals killed, drained of their blood, and burned. That's one heck of a barbecue. Okay. Annas and his family controlled all of it. All of it. He had total control. Him, his sons, his son-in-law, and everybody underneath him had it. And these are the types of things that they did. What did Jesus call them? When he went into the temple, he kicked out all of the money changers, he kicked out all the people doing all the transactions, and what did he say? Den of thieves. He called it a den of thieves. That was a mild description of what they were. First of all, it was a total spectacle in the temple. Think about if they're sacrificing 250,000 lambs, how many people are coming through the temple at this time? Maybe as many as 1 million, okay? Because it's not just one person with one lamb. That may be a family, wife, kids, brothers, sisters, daughter-in-law's former roommate. All these people are coming in. It's a spectacle of all spectacles. There is activity beyond activity. Imagine the sights, the smells, the craziness. And Annas had all of it. As sacrifices were being brought, okay, what was a Jew supposed to do? If I'm going to make sacrifices for my sins, my job, so I said, okay, what I've got to do is I've got to get a what? A spotless lamb. And if I can't afford a spotless lamb, Well, if you can't afford one too, you could maybe get some turtle doves. Those were possible plate replacements, but either way. You're in Galilee, you bring this lamb 63 miles as the crow flies, so let's not talk about how the roads were. So you probably walked 100 miles with a lamb to get there to sacrifice. You get to the gates in the areas of the temple, and this temple is thousands and thousands of people not stopping. You're here to worship God, and nothing in here is looking like it's worshiping God. You get before the Levitical priests, and they say, I'm sorry, what's wrong? Your lamb ain't good enough. So what do they have for you? They got another lamb. And what do you got to do to get that lamb? You got to pay money. And do you think they charged a fair price for said lamb? There was no such thing as a fair price. Fair price was in the mind of the person putting the price together. And so here comes the price. They pay this exorbitant price for the lamb. They take the other lamb from them, take it around to the back, give them the lamb. They go up to the temple to sacrifice their lamb. An hour later, somebody else comes through. What happens? You go, I'm sorry, that lamb won't be good. Let's go get this other lamb that just got brought in an hour ago, bring it out, and guess what it becomes? The lamb. Over and over and over again. The people had no way to combat this. There was no law. Rome was the ruling authority. Rome just wanted peace. They didn't care how peace was there. They let them go about doing this because it kept the people at bay. Because Rome knew, and I believe the chief priests and Sadducees knew, if people really got understood in what was going on, they could revolt. There was enough of them to revolt and actually win. So they kept the peace at all costs. So they let the Sadducees do it. It kept the people in line. All was good for Rome, and Annas and his family got some coin. Not only that, but you also had to have a temple tax. The temple tax had to be paid by a very specific coin. And as you came in with your money, because from all kinds of other places, they would say, I'm sorry, that money's pagan. We cannot take that money. You must go change that for a temple coin, which, by the way, had a pagan symbol on it, but that's not neither here nor there. Don't pay attention to the wizard behind the curtain. Okay. And of course, to get that coin, do you think you paid a fair price for said coin? No. You paid a ridiculous price for that coin. You took then that coin. They took your money. Then the coin that you just purchased gave them back that coin. So now you're paying triple, quadruple, whatnot. You paid for your lamb. You paid for this. And all along, all these chief priests and Sadducees are sitting back getting everything. And finally, they controlled everything in and around it. You don't think that if you had some kind of need, like I just was thinking of this. People, of all those people, how do they go to the bathroom? Do you think they charged people to go somewhere to go to the bathroom? Mm-hmm. Sure, made money. Yeah. Food, water, trinkets. People love flea markets. We got a flea market over there across the street, right? Every piece of this machine went to Annas and his sons. Now, Caiaphas, who's the one who had told Jesus' leaders it's better that one man should die, was technically speaking the high priest at this time. And let's go over a little bit of what he did. So here's the thing. Interesting about Caiaphas. He's the high priest, right? Is he corrupt? Oh, yeah. He's corrupt. They're in there, they're talking, and back in John 11, and they're like, what do we do about this Jesus? What do we got to do? And he basically says, it's better that one man should die for the people, because he doesn't want to run against Rome. Interestingly enough, though, he did not say this on his own. He had no intention of it being a prophecy, but as high priest at the time, he was led to prophesy that Jesus would then die for the entire nation. And not only for that nation, but to bring together and unite all the children of God scattered throughout the world. Here's an evil dude. Not cool. Making money. Says something as high priest, not intending it to be anything, and it ends up becoming a prophecy about what Jesus would end up doing. That's kind of a cool place to go. Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus and his followers what had been teaching. Jesus said, everyone knows what I teach, and I have preached regularly in the temple, synagogues, and temple. Where the people gather, I have not spoken in secret. Why are you asking them? Then one of the temple's guards slapped him across the face. Is this the way to answer the high priest, he demanded. Jesus replied, if I said anything wrong, you must prove it, but I'm speaking the truth. Why are you beating me? Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Okay. I separated this out from the denial from the trial. Now, I was supposed to print out the thing that had the 12 things about the trial, and I didn't print it out because I got caught talking to people. But that's okay. I can remember most of what was on it. Inside, back in Mark 14, he said this, inside, the leading priests and the entire high council were trying to find evidence against Jesus so they could put him to death, but they couldn't find any. The illegal trial of Jesus. What made what these guys were doing at this time illegal? What time? Who said it first? Someone said it's at night, right? It's at night. That was illegal according to Jewish law to actually try somebody at night. Why? Anybody? What reasons? Basically, you couldn't, they actually had, according to Jewish law, rules about how to put somebody on trial. And they are not really so dissimilar from the way we look at trials and what we got to do with trials. And one of them was, you got to have an ability to defend yourself. You got to have enough time and effort and energy to have people come in so that it's an impartial. Right? Well, who's going to show up at night? There are going to be people, your defense is going to be sleeping. The people that may have something for you are not going to be there. The people who are passionate about getting you, they'll be there. And they were there at 2 a.m. So it's at night. Where was this first trial taking place? Annas' home. Do you think a trial was ever supposed to be taken in someone's home? No. There's courts or before the Sanhedrin are the proper place. And the very first thing they do is they take him straight to the dawn. Right? Annas has to be in the mix. He's not even high priest technically, but who's the high priest really? Annas. Annas is the high priest. Regardless of whether Caiaphas has a name or his sons have a name, Annas is the high priest. They go to him first to figure out, what are we going to do with him? They can't find anything about him. Other interesting aspects of being illegal. Here's one. You actually had to bring a criminal charge against somebody. You actually had to have a charge to bring. They had none. All the witnesses, it said, all the witnesses they had no charge to charge him with. The best they came up with was he said he was going to destroy the temple and in 3 days rebuild it. Obviously, Jesus was speaking metaphorically. He wasn't saying he was going to destroy the temple. He was saying something different. And finally, how did they actually convict Jesus? What did they actually convict him of, so to speak? What was it? Blasphemy. That too. But blasphemy. But why did they convict him of blasphemy? Did they have any witnesses against it? No. What did they end up doing? Then the high priest stood up before the others and asked Jesus, well, aren't you going to answer these charges? What do you have to say for yourself? But Jesus was silent and made no reply. Then the high priest asked him, are you the Messiah, the Son of the Blessed One? Jesus said, I am, and you will see the Son of Man seated in the place of God's right hand and coming on the clouds of heaven. At that point, the high priest tears his robes and said, we don't need to hear anything else. He said it himself. That's blasphemy. We're done. But Jewish law said this: a man's testimony cannot convict him. You actually had to have evidence in order to convict him. There's a difference between in testimony saying something that they say is there. I can go before a police and actually confess, but that's a confession. I don't need a trial in a confession, right? One doesn't need to be in trial to be confessed. But if you're in a trial, the things that you say are not necessarily, especially according to Jewish law, are not something they can convict you of. You actually have to have evidence of said crimes to be able to be convicted. They convicted him of blasphemy. Now, take that aside. When they went before Pilate now, and we're going to do that next week, but when they went before Pilate, was blasphemy the charge? No. You think Pilate in the Rome cares about blasphemy? They blaspheme every day. They accused him of treason. He's no friend to Caesar's. Again, no conviction, no real charges. The charge you charge him with, you took him before Rome and said something completely different and went about something completely different. And at the end of the day, Pilate, what does Pilate say? I find nothing wrong with this guy. And they continue and continue and continue to beat Pilate down until Pilate finally succumbs and says, fine, crucify him. But it's on your hands, not mine. These guys were corrupt to the very core. When Jesus stood and called them broods of vipers, actually John called them brood of vipers at that one point in time, but when Jesus went through and had the criticisms of them, they weren't just criticisms because they were kind of running against the law. No, these were corrupt thieves stealing and basically keeping people from the kingdom of God. That ultimately was what they really were guilty of, was basically harming people, ordinary people that were just trying to live their lives, trying to come to some semblance of what their relationship with God needs to be like. And they took full and unadulterated advantage of it at every level. And Jesus walked in and talked about it, and they hated him for it because they saw what was coming. They weren't upset because he said blasphemy. They were upset because he was about to challenge the very thing that made them wealthy, rich, and powerful. Had nothing to do with God, had everything to do with himself.
Was that another reason that it was at night? Because a lot of people loved him and believed him, so they would have been positive witnesses.
Which is why it was at night and done in secret and done early in the morning. Because the people, he was teaching in the temple for a week. People loved Jesus at this point, and if they arrested him in the temple, what would have happened? A possible riot. So what do? They pay Judas, which is another illegal act, by the way, of a trial. They pay Judas to take them to Jesus so they can arrest him at midnight, try him at 2 in the morning, at 3 in the morning, and maybe at the crack of dawn, you have some semblance of legality of your time before the Sanhedrin, and then accuse him of something that you can't actually prove and go through. All of this was out of fear. Fear of Jesus, fear of the people, fear of what was going to go on. And Rome was going to go along with this, guys. Rome wants peace. These guys were the power. They were going to hold that power in place because all chaos would have broken loose if they didn't. Juxtapose this to Simon Peter, our boy. My man. Big Simon. What was Simon known for doing up to this point in terms of talking to Jesus? He opened his mouth. He liked to open his mouth. Jesus would ask a question, and the other disciples around him would be like, and he'd be like, "Oh, you're the Son of God, the one." Look at you, Peter. Look how cool you are. What did he do hours before the arrest of Jesus? I'll die for you, Jesus. And all the other disciples like, "Oh yeah, we'll die for you too." Oh, yeah, you are. Okay. An hour later, gone. Yeah, psych. We good. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the priest's courtyard with Jesus. Who was that other disciple? Most likely it was John. The way John talks about himself in the book of John leads us to believe this was John that was there, which would also make sense of saying why John writes this and none of the other gospel writers wrote this. John had intimate knowledge of this event because it's him. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching the gate, and she let Peter in. John had that unique perspective of what was going on here. He understood what was happening because he was there. And so when he says, "You're not one of the man's disciples, are you?" John knows this story with Peter because it was an eyewitness account of this time. "No," he said, "I am not," because it was cold. The household servants and the guards had made a charcoal fire. They stood around it, warming themselves, and Peter stood with them, warming himself. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the warming fire, they asked him again, "You're not one of the disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I am not." And finally, a third time, and then after the third time, a rooster crows. Jesus predicted it. Peter fell into it. My assumptions of Peter here have been ongoing and long. I have been very critical of Peter in my life about this. I said he was a coward in my head. I said there was very little reason for him to do what he did. All the braggadocious statements backed that up, and that he was weak. There's a couple aspects to this that I just came across that my brain just kind of went, wow. First, what did Jesus do that I talked about last week over the entirety of the arrest when Judas got there? What did Jesus have over the whole thing? He controlled it. He had total control over his own arrest. And what did he do with that control? He made sure what didn't happen. He made sure his disciples didn't get arrested because he knew they couldn't handle it at that time. Peter, in his dedication to Jesus, finally says, "Okay, I'm going to follow and figure out what's happening with Jesus here." So he goes in, as did John, most likely, into this area. Peter just saw anywhere from 500 to 1,000 people try to come arrest Jesus. He saw their anger, their scorn, their hardness of heart towards him and them. So when he's asked, "Are you a follower of Jesus?" where is he at the moment? He's standing amongst them. I'm not excusing him of it, but I'm saying his life at this point was at risk. It's obviously told to us because it's his denial of Jesus, but it also allowed him to survive. Are we so different? Do we have situations in our life that come up? I had to actually ask myself, you know what? I'm Peter. I can say braggadocious big things. But when push comes to shove and there's something really on the line, I've compromised, as Peter did. Talk about that in a second. Later on in Acts, Peter and John, I believe, actually, interestingly enough, Peter and John, are brought before Annas again, actually. They're actually brought before Annas and Sadducees and Pharisees. And this time, because they healed somebody in the temple. This is after Jesus' death. And what does Peter now do? He stands up and gives an account. This is who Jesus is, and I follow him. I ask you in this, can God take our weakest moments and turn them into something strong? He took Peter's weakest moments and maybe 5 months later turns Peter into a bold preacher of God's holy word about who Jesus was and salvation, and began Christianity as we know it. A couple things to ponder as we end. God uses everything. I'm going to try and do this in 3 minutes. Good luck. The Jewish people from the time of Moses to the time of the Babylonian exile did this in their worship of God. They worshiped God sometimes, but most of the time they brought in idols, all kinds of other things, and didn't worship God most of the time. God punished them. The Assyrians came down, took over the northern part of the empire, took them away. The Babylonians took over the Assyrians and came down and took over Judah, took them off into exile. Through that time, the Babylonians got conquered by the Persians. The Persians came in 70 years. In that, after the end of it, God's name was so well respected amongst the Persians that the Persian king allowed Ezra and Nehemiah to go rebuild Jerusalem and the temple to bring the Jews back to their homeland. And from that time on, the Jews no longer did this. They stayed with God for the next 400 years. So much so, the Greeks came in, and interestingly enough, the Greeks were a bunch of tribes, a bunch of little city-states, and didn't have any kind of cohesion about them. But the Persians, being the Persians, decided we're going to take over the entire known world, and brought an army to that. The movie 300, everybody, that's what that was them doing this. So the Greeks band together and create a force to be able to beat the Persians. Out of that comes a man by the name of Alexander the Great. If you haven't seen The Chosen Season 4, one of the things it does, it talks about Hanukkah. Hanukkah is the 8-day festival. It is the celebration of what happened after the Greeks took over. The Greeks ruled with Alexander the Great with an iron thumb, not wanting anybody to be different than the Greeks. They instituted their language, they instituted their culture, and they destroyed and tortured anybody who did not. So Alexander the Great dies, his minions take over, and Antiochus Epiphanes comes into Jerusalem and tries to destroy everything Jewish. The Maccabees rise up, revolt, get them out, and then the Jews now take over and now begin to establish the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the temple system as they knew it at Jesus' time. And a couple other interesting things happen. Because Greece took over, they spread Greek as the language throughout the entire world. So everybody now spoke Greek. But the Romans now come in and take over the Greeks. What do the Romans do? They don't care about your culture. They let your culture be it so the Jews can continue on. But they build roads and safety of travel. So all the things that the temple became that because everybody could now travel back to Jerusalem to do the things that they needed to do. And Rome allows this thing to take place and allows the power of Annas to grow. And the Pharisees and their influence. And in walks Jesus, sharing a message of the good news of the kingdom of God, completely against all these things. And the people love it. They hear it. But all of these other forces take place, and they end up killing him. Now, none of that was necessarily good, but God uses everything. He used the Greek language to be able to spread Christianity throughout the entire empire. He used the Roman roads to be able to let people travel wherever they wanted to and however they wanted to safely so they weren't killed. And he used the very vitriol of people to sacrifice his son for our sins. Nothing's apart from him. I didn't even practice that.
But with our prayers,
Yep.
I know how to say it.
Yep. There you go. Finally, he who has ears, let them hear. This was a difficult one to have some kind of sum up. It's narrative. It's telling the story. But I'm going to say, this is what I do my best thinking in the shower right before I get ready to come here, okay? So I put all this together. I got all this. I'm like, man, that's great information, Josh. You're going to have a ball doing it, because I do. By the way, I love doing this, okay? This is fun. But this is what came to my mind. He who has ears, let them hear. When I do this and talk to people afterward, when we do our Thursday night class, hi Thursday night class back there, anyway. When I do my Thursday night class and we get done, something happens amongst us, and something needs to happen amongst us when we do this. The truth has been presented. We hear the truth, and what does Jesus say? The truth will bring you joy. In a world full of chaos and ambiguity and distrust and all kinds of lies and everything else, in here we have the truth that we can hold on to, grab onto, live our life based on. And guys, if your attitude's right and your heart's right, when you hear his truth about who these people were, about who Peter was, about who Jesus was in all of this, and we hear and we understand, guys, when I went through this, I went, oh my gosh, I have listened, I have studied, I have been through John 100 times at some level. And all of this brought joy. I have loved every second of going through this book. It has been more meaningful than most anything I've done in my life. And when I've been able to have the privilege of putting this together and the humility of hearing people encourage me, I encourage you, we do this together. We listen to truth together. That brings us joy. If you have ears, that's what Jesus is saying. If you have ears, then hear. You know who didn't have ears? Sadducees, Pharisees, Romans. Although I would make an argument Romans actually listened a little bit more than the Sadducees and the Pharisees. Because there are stories of Romans that are going, who is this guy? What is he doing? And oh my gosh, he can do that. And they came to a faith in him. Worship team can come up. This is fun for me. I enjoy it. And I enjoy it because it's truth. And I enjoy it because God has mercy on me to be able to see something that I'm not worthy of seeing. We're together. We're going to be together eating. We're going to be together singing. Have the ears to hear the truth. And may that truth lead to joy in your life, and may that joy be full. That's what this is. At a bare minimum, we can do it once a week together, and I hope we do it longer than that. Father, the ability to have ears to hear means you have to be humble. Means you have to set aside your preconceived assumptions. And I've made a lot of them. You showed me. Break them down. Listen to truth and let it change you. And better yet, let it change you amongst other people. Not just changing you, but changing how you treat, how you interact, and what you do for your friends, for your families, for your acquaintances, and for those people that you may have just met. Truth does that for us. It brings joy, and that joy is inexplicable, and it can be shared simply by being with somebody. We love you. We thank you for your Son, his sacrifice for us, and we praise you. In your Son's name, amen.
All the foreign powers